Good morning and welcome to the Walk Off, everybody. I'm Scott Belford. This is the Friday show, and I'm very excited to have a special guest for today's podcast. So thrilled to have returning host and producer at 590 The Fan Sportsnet. Many of you listen to him all season long on Jays Talk. Maybe you called in. SHO ALLI. Welcome back to the Walk Off, man. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, what's up, Scott? How's it going today?
It's been going really well, man. I know baseball downtime, you rarely get that in the 162 game season that you're doing Jays talk on. I'm guessing that you're still just enjoying a switch up in schedule right now.
Yeah, so I think they got me doing a football show. I work on. I'm one of the producers for we have Jays Talks, we have Leafs Talk as well.
Yes.
So I'm one of the producers for Leafs Talks. That's always kind of fun, but it's nice to like fill the time. But it's funny. I think I'm at the point now that the World Series is over, and glad it wasn't like a super competitive World Series either.
Yeah.
So I think I am ready for the Jays to come back. I might regret saying that when we get to like July, but still, I think I'm ready.
See, that's the proof you are an actual baseball nerd because when we're reaching the end of November and the real hardcore fans start getting squirrely, being like, oh, I could handle some baseball right now, that's how you know you're hooked.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And you know what's funny? Like I loved the World Series. Like the World Series in the sense of like I people were like, oh, the Yankees and the Dodgers, it's the two biggest spending teams, the two biggest markets. Like Rob Manfred must be so excited. And I'm sure he was. And I know
Yeah.
people were kind of like underwhelmed because it was a 5 game series. The Dodgers kind of just put it to bed as soon as they could. But I kind of enjoyed maybe this is bad of me watching the Yankees flame out in like embarrassing fashion and like,
Oh,
essentially like the worst possible way, right?
yeah. Oh, honestly, I've said this a few times now, is like by the end of this season, right? Like by the end of the playoffs, the only thing I was clinging to was the tears of Yankees fans. And the Dodgers delivered in spades, right? Like, it was nice if you're an AL East fan just cheered against the Yankees. It worked out how you would have wanted. Now, obviously, if you're an NL West fan, tougher times, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think I do think Blue Jays fans probably had an easier time swallowing the Dodgers winning, if only because I don't know. I don't know about you. I don't know if a lot of people are still mad about Shohei not signing with the Blue Jays. I don't really think so. I don't really get that
No.
vibe, but I do think it made it easier that Teo was on the team and Kiermaier. I know Kiermaier
Hmm.
didn't play, but he was on the team, and you see Hazel interviewing the two of them after the game. I think people were pretty happy, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's funny too watching playoff baseball when you don't have a horse in the race. There's almost like obviously I'd rather my horse be in the race every time
Yes.
show, but there is some joy to watching it anxiety free. That if the Jays were in it, I would not be enjoying the baseball. I'd be
No.
pulling my hair out, right?
No, I'm with you. I'm with you. I don't think it would have been a particularly stress less watch. So I am happy for that. I guess that's a silver lining of the Jays having one of the worst seasons in recent memory. I
Yeah.
suppose.
You get to enjoy the other baseball. Yeah. I don't want that to become the norm though, which
No, me
we'll
neither.
we'll dive into, but we're definitely at a turning point for this team, I think, this season. And I know that when you look at free agency this year, one thing's for sure about baseball free agency, it sure doesn't get out of the gate like NHL and NFL and NBA. I mean, my goodness, dude, we're almost a month in, and what have we seen? Jose Siri traded? Like, I'm ready for something to happen here, and I really thought that this year there'd be more action by now. Are we kind of seeing the same thing we saw last year with Otani holding things up? Like, is Juan Soto need to sign before we really watch the floodgates open? Do you think?
Yeah, because last year it kind of felt like with Otani, everyone felt like they were in on him, or at least the big teams felt like they were in on him, so they waited. And the Yankees actually last year, I thought they did the prudent thing. They didn't really wait, right? Like they didn't wait on Otani because it was clear they weren't going to get him. So they went out and they traded for Stoto, and that
Mhm.
was their big offseason acquisition, and it worked. Hey, it worked out well for them, right? But you look at this year, and I actually think more dominoes are waiting to fall because of Juan Soto. Right, to your point. I mean,
Yeah.
like if the Mets do get Juan Soto, then they're. I mean, we don't know this, but we got to think that Pete Alonso is not going to re-sign with the Mets, and so therefore there are a whole bunch of other teams that, like the Blue Jays, I'm sure, that would love to sign Pete Alonso. If the Yankees signed Juan Soto, then maybe the Mets will pivot to an Adames or one of the top free agent starting pitchers, for example, if they don't get Soto. The Blue Jays are one of those teams as well. I mean, the Blue Jays have somehow been linked, Scott, to every
Yeah.
massive free agent. And look, I know people like to say the Blue Jays don't spend money. I think we have seen that they spend money, even if it's not Otani level money. They have spent money on like one big free agent a year. And I do think that will happen. It's just, I got to say, I did not expect the names the Blue Jays to be linked to outside of Juan Soto to be Corbin Burns, Max Fried, and Blake Snell. Not that I'm complaining, but
No.
I did not expect that whatsoever, which is kind of funny the way things work. It would be kind of morbidly funny if the Blue Jays went out and signed Max Fried or Corbin Burns. I'd be really happy, but then they didn't sign an impact bat, and then we're just having the same
Oh,
conversations we had for all of last year.
Show, I'm going to lose my mind if the narrative this next season is once again this team doesn't have a cleanup hitter. Like, my goodness.
You'll take Josh Bell and you'll like it.
Honestly, like that's where we're at as Blue Jays fans. And I love how you put that there is this narrative that the Blue Jays are always runner up or being used as leverage. And I'm not saying that that's not the case in certain scenarios, but they definitely do spend money. I don't know if you saw this stat, but this kind of blew my mind. So this is how much money each team has spent in free agency since 2020.
Right.
So the number one team in baseball, I don't think we need any geniuses or scientists to figure this out after watching them spend $700 million last year on Otani. But the Dodgers are in at number one with $1.59 billion spent since 2020. The Yankees are second on that list at 1.11 billion. The Phillies 1.08 billion. The Mets just under $1 billion at $998 million. Then you've got the Rangers at 966, the Giants at 768, the Cubs at 601, and right under it, the Blue Jays in at number 8. And just to put in perspective for people who don't think the Blue Jays spend, $601 million over 4 years is pretty impressive, especially when you look at the bottom two teams show, who both were in the playoffs last year. The Baltimore Orioles spent $57 million over the last 4 years in free agency, $77 million to the Guardians.
Man, I guess I guess that's in free agency only, right?
Yes.
So I was gonna say, like, I'm surprised other teams aren't even lower, but I guess technically even one massive free agent could bump your total. Like I was gonna think the Pirates are probably at the bottom, but even they probably have spent like a little bit, whereas the Orioles, to your point, have just graduated guys from the minor leagues, it feels like, for years and years now at this point, right? But that's pretty crazy, honestly. I mean, I think that does underscore the point for the Blue Jays. I mean, essentially, since I remember when Shapiro and Atkins arrived in Toronto, right? People were, I think, concerned they were going to run the team like a small market operation. And I think for the first couple of years they were here, they did do that. And then Hyunjin Ryu was I think the signing and he was a Scott Boras client, where I thought to myself, okay, like they're actually going to go after Scott Boras clients, which we had not really seen much of. He kind of like made fun of the Blue Jays.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So we know well all about Scott Boras' comments with the Blue Jays, and then they signed like the ERA leader in Ryu, and then every year since it's been like a Springer, it's been Chapman was traded for, but it's been a Gosman or a Bassett, right? Like it's guys like that, right? And I think that's totally fine. But I said this before a lot on Jays Talk last year. It's not really a question of whether or not they spend money. It's whether or not they're spending it wisely, right? Because to your point, I mean, $600 million is a lot of money, but it has not bought you a single playoff win in that time frame. So, look, would I be thrilled, ecstatic if Burns or Fried or Snell was a Blue Jay long term? That'd be really cool, and I think it would make them once again one of the best rotations, if not the best rotation in baseball, if you believe Bowden Francis is for real. But gosh, I mean, you need a bat.
Yeah,
right?
you
Like you need,
really
like
do.
I'm not even really that picky at this point. Like if you want to sign Adames or Bregman or any of them, do it. Pete Alonso, I don't really care at this point. I'll take any of them.
And I know Adam and I have mentioned this numerous times on the podcast, but the one thing with this era of Blue Jays baseball that really kind of is a dagger in the back right now is we haven't had any moments. You know, like we were touted and hyped up the Bo and Vlad era. And it's not that there haven't been some successes, but just not any you can really hang your hat on, you know? And you look back at the 2015 and 2016 era, and I know that we're not hanging World Series banners from that. I'm well aware. But we had those moments, show, right? We had the bat flip. We had Eddie's wild card extra innings home run. We had the Donaldson dash. We had those moments that were just so special. And we just really haven't had any of those with Bo and Vlad. And I know we touched on Soto. I do. Everyone is so quick to just say we're being used as leverage, which it's a Boris client in an industry based on how much money can you make. Obviously, everyone involved in these sweepstakes for Soto are involved in leverage play, right? But with Shapiro's contract up at the end of 2025 and this window obviously closing, I know that this front office told us there is no such thing as a window and you can be a perennial winner. I mean, that's just not the case right now. Vladdy's going to free agency. Bo's going to free agency. I mean, knock on wood, they can pull something off extension wise. So I guess all of this preamble ramble up to ask you, could we see this front office have a, for lack of a better term, a fuck it moment? Like, could we see this front office for the first time? And I'm not saying that there might not have been a little bit of that with George Springer, but for the first real time, be like, you know what? The Mets are offering 660, 701. 701, Soto, come be the highest paid player in baseball. Do you think we're getting to the point, like, could this front office feel like their backs are against the wall? Because we've never seen that out of them before.
No, it's true. And I do think with Soto, the reason I believe, look, do I think it's like likely it's going to happen? Probably not. But do I think that it's a genuine interest? Because I think you're right. Like with Ohtani, it seemed pretty likely that he was never leaving Los Angeles just because, I mean, like it wasn't like he was coming from nowhere to go to Los Angeles, right? He was already playing in Los Angeles. We knew he had a preference to stay on the West Coast. And like, honestly, I didn't really believe it right up until I saw the stuff about the plane. And that, that got me. I
Yeah,
will
I
say,
know. Me too.
we were all in the newsroom right over there. And we were all like, I was standing there with Blair and I was standing there with like Ailish. And we were all like huddled around the TV watching someone get off a plane. We're like, is that Shohei
We
Ohtani?
were all so level headed until December 8th.
We all got lost our head. I'll give Blair credit. He literally he looked around, like there were like 15 people huddled around this tiny little TV, and he was like, "I'm not participating in this," and then he walked away. He was the only one who had the sense to walk away. I'll give him some credit on that, but
Yeah.
I do think it's different with Soto because Soto has checked all the boxes for his career, which is startlingly young already. I mean, he's already
Mm-hmm.
made a boatload of money. He's already won a World Series. He's already set a whole bunch of records. He said he's hit a crap ton of home runs. Like I really do believe when he says, "I just want to make as much money as humanly possible, and I'll play anywhere if that gets me the most money." I really believe that. And if that's the case, then the Blue Jays genuinely do have a real chance because, I mean, whether or not they will spend it is one thing, but whether or not they have the resources to spend is absolutely the answer to that question is a resounding yes. And the funny thing is, you asked if it's about the front office. I actually think more it's about ownership. Like, does
Yeah.
Ed Rogers want to be outbid once again just after he just spent hundreds of millions of dollars in upgrading
Give
the
me
stadium,
some billionaire hubris, show.
yeah, right. Like that hubris is absolutely why Steve Cohen is going to go out of his way and offer Soto the moon because this is like a billionaire hedge fund manager who is used to getting what he wants. Like, but Steve Cohen, I actually recently learned this. I didn't know this. I don't know if you knew this or not, but Steve Cohen is the basis for the character on Billions. Like he is like
No, I didn't know that.
the main character from Billions that Damian Lewis plays with Paul Giamatti. Damian Lewis's character, I forget what his name is, but that character is inspired by Steve Cohen. Like that show is about financial hubris, essentially, right? So that guy wants to sign Juan Soto. I feel like he probably will, but you can't tell me that the Steinbrenners and the Rogers and other billionaires don't also want the same thing, right? So I think if they get into a bidding war, maybe the Rogers will win. But all I can think of is like you want to make sure your stadium is full of fans. It was a bad season. There's some question marks around the other stars that you mentioned with Vladdy and Bo, not from a performance standpoint necessarily, but from a will they be Blue Jays long-term standpoint. And I mean, people keep asking the question on Jays Talk, like, who is the next most attractive player if Bo and Vladdy leave? I have no idea what the answer to that question is. Truthfully, like I guess it's looking forward to like a teenage Arjun Nimala to come up at some point in the next like 3-4 years. But if it's not Vladdy or Bo, the best possible solution I got to think is signing Juan Soto. And I mean, again, is it particularly likely? Probably not. But I think it's real that there is a discussion and that there is an offer.
And some of the peripheral stuff does look better for the Blue Jays than with Ohtani, right? Like, let's face it, I've been to the Dominican Republic. That country loves baseball.
They do.
And honestly, show everywhere you go, there are Blue Jays jerseys. And yes, of course, there's Nationals jerseys and Yankees jerseys, and they just have a love of wherever their Dominican players land. But the Blue Jays do have a rich history of Dominican players that go back, and I mean further than the 2015-16 era, right? Like we're talking the Tony Fernandez, Manuel Lees of the world here that kind of like built the bedrock for the Dominican players coming over. And the Blue Jays have been involved in that since day one. So they're on the same time zone. There are little things that like, yes, the West Coast was very appealing to Ohtani because Japanese fans could watch it far easier there. Whereas honestly, it's easier for Dominican fans to watch the East Coast. So one bonus thing, but I will ask this, all right? So the Blue Jays, like we just said, they're in the mix with the other 4 mega spending teams, the New Yorks, the Boston, the Dodgers. Hal Steinbrenner was asked how confident he was. How confident he is that he will be a Yankee. And I kind of loved his answer because he was just like, no idea. We'll be in the mix. We'll be in the mix. I'll leave it at that. He then stated Soto was very interested in their player development and how that went down, which was a red flag for me. If he is, if player development is part of his measuring stick, that's kind of a black eye on the Blue Jays, correct?
Yeah, the way it stands right now, yeah. I mean, the farm is more or less empty of the kind of prospects that would help a Soto, for example, right? Because I got to think, in addition to that, like I wonder if his ask of every team is different. But I mean, if you're right, if he's asking about player development for the Jays, it would not does bode well. But I got to think his first question to Ross Atkins wouldn't even be about player development. It'll be, hey, are you signing my best friend Vladdy to a long-term deal? Like, what's the interest in me coming? Like, we just talked about the Dominican and all the great things about it. Like, what's my interest in as Juan Soto in coming to play for your team? If like my good buddy Vladdy is going to if he's going to go play for the Yankees in a year's time, or if he's going to go play with Fernando Tatis in San Diego in a year's time, like who knows, right? Like who absolutely knows. So that'd be my first and second question to Ross Atkins. Like, hey, why isn't Vladdy under contract? Or if he's not, I need you to, if I'm signed, when I put my name on the dotted line, I need his name to also be on a dotted line of another contract too. So, but I agree with you. The player development aspect of it beyond who's actually on the roster is a little grim. No, I mean, I mentioned Arjun Nimala. He might be the only sexy prospect in the minors. Like there are a couple of pitching prospects, but again, we want to be a little more excited about the hitters, and they haven't done the best job of developing hitters, maybe outside of the Buffalo Brigade that are now basically all in the majors already.
Yeah. It's honestly, when it comes to player development, and I wish I knew a little bit more about the ins and outs of it, but it does feel like it's almost, I mean, it's a bad job, obviously, with how much they've produced over 9 years. It's a bad record of what they've done. Not that they haven't developed some players. Obviously, they have. It feels like bad luck, even a little bit, to have not just run into one, right? And I'm not putting down what we saw last year. I know I was lucky enough to be sent down to Buffalo and cover the
I saw that.
Bisons.
That's pretty cool.
And it was very cool. And I know that there was a moment in September when I was sitting in the press box and a couple of the other reporters there, we kind of tallied up all of the players who had worn both a Blue Jays jersey and a Bison's jersey. And without any official count, we stopped counting at 31,
Okay.
which is a full roster plus, right? Like, that's an insane amount of players to have played for both teams in 1 year. So
No,
they
it's true.
do have an ability to develop low end talent. I know that's the wrong. I'm having a trouble communicating what I'm trying to say here, right? Like, obviously you don't get that many guys who play both AAA and the majors in 1 year without having some success on the player development side, but we're just not seeing any of those high end guys getting developed.
Yeah, like the guys we're talking about, and I mean Spencer Horwitz and maybe
Mm-hmm.
Will Wagner and these guys. Like, I'm not knocking their ability, but I mean these are on a 26-man active roster. They are like guys 22 to 26 kind of thing, right? And that's kind of where we're at right now. And you're right. Like, beyond Vladdy, Bo, Biggio, certainly when he was called up. I mean, that's not
Yeah,
how it ended for him, obviously, but like I would say he was a part of that group.
for
So
sure.
Vladdy, Bo, Biggio. I wonder if I'm forgetting. I guess Kirk to a lesser extent, but he was
Mm-hmm.
he was a little lower down, but a little higher than Horwitz and those guys.
I want to give them credit for Manoah too, but he pitched
Yeah, sure.
what, like, not, I think he pitched under 30 innings total in the minors. So, like,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. He was called up very quickly, right? Like I,
yes.
I actually was a little concerned when Manoah got called up because I'm like, man, this guy has like two pitches. How is he going to survive in Major League
Oh, it's
Baseball?
one I've had to eat my words on a few times.
Yeah,
When they first called Manoah up, both Adam and I were like, what are you doing? Like, don't ruin this kid just because you desperately need starting pitching. And then it.
hey, I mean, like I know it didn't work out last year, but the year he got called up. Holy crap, he was
Oh,
phenomenal, right? So no, so I think there have been successes, but I'm with you. Like the vast majority of, at least in 2024, the vast majority of guys who got called up were like the De Los Santoses of the world. I'm not, and again, like I mean, these are guys who grinded and grinded, and like they deserve their
sure.
opportunity. But like we're not talking about, unfortunately, we're not talking about like difference makers at or near the top of the order. Like I think when Will Wagner was acquired, I don't know if you can really give them credit for that because they went out and got him, but he wasn't like developed by this team, and he instantly became one of the best players that
Yeah.
were like from like a minor league sense that got added to the major league roster, and he wasn't even developed by this team. So I think you're right. Like, I do wonder what that looks like going forward. They do have a new director of amateur scouting, I guess, now, which
Yes.
is kind of interesting. And I mean, this same guy, Mark Tremuta, is a guy who was in the team last year. He was a advisor of some sort in 2023. But this is the guy who scouted Pete Alonso and Mark Vientos, and like, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I'm sure when you hear director of amateur scouting, I'm sure they're like you have to highlight your wins because I'm sure like there are so many guys you miss on because of the sheer amount of prospects and draft picks that you like have to do that. But I do
Yes.
think it's like it bodes well that this is a guy who helped the Mets get to where they are at least.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. I don't know if you saw which, you know what? It is nice to see new voices in the front office. They're at least mixing it up a little. We'll see if it all just becomes one collaborative voice in the end anyways, but it is nice that it's the first time we've seen them kind of address some of those holes on the player development side that, guys like you and I have been talking about for years. So them doing something's better than nothing.
Yeah. No, it's true. It really is true. And I guess to your point, I'm curious like what the process looks like. Like trust the process. I'm curious what it looks like because look, you and I talked about analytics before, and analytics is needed. Every team, no matter how much you think they don't use analytics, I promise everyone that every one of your favorite teams in every sport on earth, not even in North America and beyond, they all use analytics, right? But I do think that I wonder sometimes if there's a way to use the information that analytics are giving you in better ways, right? So I am interested to see. I mean, look, Tremuta was in the organization last year, so he clearly knows how Atkins does things, but that he was not some guy who came over from Cleveland with them. I do wonder if that means they're trying something different at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
I do wonder.
So I saw, and I'm not sure if you saw it or not, the Jose Barrios quote floating around from yesterday when he was asked about the Jays' pursuit of Juan Soto. And this has been translated from Spanish to English,
Okay.
but the crux of it was when we sign Vladdy, we can sign whoever they want. But I think the priority should be Vladimir Guerrero Jr. And then if we add Juan Soto, it would be the perfect world. Now, I get what he's saying here. And I'm curious if you think that that's the general feeling in the clubhouse or if this is more Jose having his boys back type of thing. Because obviously, Vladdy's representation would be insane to sign a deal before Juan Soto's deal gets signed, right? Because I feel like no matter what Juan Soto gets, Vladimir Guerrero Jr. gets 2/3 of that.
Right.
Like, how can you? It gets rid of the Devers comparison, right? Like right now, that's probably the closest comparison to Vladdy is Rafael Devers, 320 over 10 years in Boston. But if Juan Soto signs a 12-year deal for $680 million, then it would be terrible agent work if they can't convince someone else that Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is worth $400 million. Uh,
No,
do you agree with
I'm with
that?
you. No, I'm
Yeah.
totally with you. I'm with you because that's just the cost of doing business, essentially, right? Like it kind of reminds me, like to a certain degree. I don't know how big of an NFL fan you are, Scott, but it does remind me of how like quarterback A signs his deal, and quarterbacks are like the most important position in that sport. So he's quarterback A signs his deal, and then quarterback B, who's like just as good or maybe even slightly worse, says, "Well, quarterback A signed for 50 million a year. I want 51 million a year." And then
Yeah.
the next guy who maybe is just as good or maybe even worse says, "Well, I want $55 million a year." And then you have quarterback F and G and H who signed for 60
Which
million
just
and
keeps
60.
bumping
Yeah,
the
it
price
just
up
keeps
and
going.
lowering the value. Yeah.
It just keeps going. And so I think that's what's going to happen with Soto is that it's not, I'm not saying he's not worth the money. He clearly is a generational player, and generational players that become available at this age, it just doesn't
Never
happen, right?
happens. Yeah.
So I get that everyone's going to want to offer him that money, but Vladdy is not that far away from him. And he's also a young guy. So the argument from Vladdy's camp will absolutely be if Juan Soto gets $685 million, well, I deserve $425 million. I'm pretty good too, and I'm going to be a free agent, and no one else is going to be as good as me as a free agent. So like it would be almost like irresponsible of Vladdy to not test free agency if the Jays don't give him what he wants,
Yeah.
which would be crazy. And I mean, the same goes for Bo, right? I mean, I'm interested to see what Willy Adames makes this offseason because I think he's going to get absolutely paid, but I wonder if he'll get the same amounts of money that like a Corey Seager got or that like a Lindor got or that who signed in with the Padres from the Red Sox, Bogarts, right?
Yeah.
So like I wonder what the with those deals, when they signed those deals, I'm sure Bo was like, "Yeah, it's excellent. I'm going to be a very wealthy man." But like even more so now, right? So to your question about Barrios though, I do having met Jose a couple times. That is the kind of guy who values his boys and loyalty above, I think, literally any other player I've ever met.
I
Like
love that.
he puts it he clearly puts a premium on that. So I'm sure if the Blue Jays signed Juan Soto, he would like privately be thrilled. Like he would,
Yes.
and I bet every other player on the team would be absolutely over the moon. But I think if he's asked about it in public, I'm not shocked that he was like, "Oh yeah, Vladdy's the priority. Take care of Vladdy. He's the guy," because that's just who Jose is, which is I think a really cool thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And I do think that having that loyalty and that camaraderie is good for the clubhouse. Speaking of the clubhouse, do you feel like by the end of last year, they were, I mean, obviously when you're losing and you're in last place and there's not a lot of pressure anymore, it gets looser in the clubhouse.
Right.
Did you feel like it had morphed into a more fun clubhouse by the end of the year? It just felt like the guys were, there was that kind of, what's the right word? Confidence, machismo kind of going on a little bit. The barrio felt like it was sort of in place again.
Yeah, I definitely think when I went down to the ballpark a handful of times, it was a little looser. Like it was that's you know what I mean. Like people were a little less tight, and I mean, I'm sure part of it was because you remember last year. I mean, Bassett talking to the media, and he kind of played GM, and people kind of like really dived into those comments, and people were upset about what he said, and he shouldn't have said this, and he should have said that. I think it was on the Chris Rose podcast, and then
Yeah.
I think Gosman had said multiple times after losses, like, yeah, if we don't pitch really well, we're going to lose, right? Which is kind of like an indictment of the hitting and the bats and the offense,
Yeah.
generally speaking. And it's funny because it seemed really tense and tight when that was happening, and then like a couple weeks later, a month later, it was all very maybe they handled it in house, but whenever they were out on the field, they were
Or
joking
once they were
around. And
mathematically eliminated, they were
maybe
like,
that's what it
you know
was.
what?
Because there was that stretch, right? Like after the deadline where they did play well, like they
Yeah.
played better. And I mean, that didn't last 100%, but I mean, maybe the schedule eased up a little bit as well. But no, I do think it was a little easier for everyone. Vladdy started hitting again. Maybe he had the Samson haircut, right? Maybe that's why. But the Buffalo Brigade were all playing pretty well as well. The pitchers had seemingly found a groove. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe that's just the natural ebb and flow of a season. But you're right. I mean, maybe the pressure being off lent itself to that situation. I mean, you want to see them do it when the pressure is on,
Yes.
because that would be nice. But yeah, I do think they got away from kind of shooting themselves in the foot towards the end of the season.
So I know you touched on it already, just the fact that the Jays have been linked to some pretty high-end starting pitching, which has surprised some people. They're interested in the starting pitching market, right? I mean, they were tied to Snell, tied to Burns, tied to
Freed.
Max Fried. Yes, thank you. Starting pitching is always expensive show. I mean, we just watched Nick Pivetta turn down a $21.5 million qualifying offer, which
Yeah.
means he feels that he's going to get $22 million a year at
Come on
least.
home, Nick. Come back to Canada.
And term. Um, I was just going to ask you your thoughts on Nick Pivetta in general. I mean, a lefty with Kikuchi leaving, there is a spot open for a lefty. Yeah. I mean, you would like to at least have one in your starting rotation. And how high on the quality scale can you see this team going? And I know everyone kind of has brought up the money of it all, right? And that the Shapiro has kind of stated they're trying to stick around the same kind of budget as last year, or this is the lip service he's given, which kind of gives you that 30 to 60 million to play with in there.
Sure.
But that said, there's not a lot of money on the books after 2025, right? I mean, you've got Jose Barrios and George Springer on the books in 2026, then almost nothing. I mean, outside of Barrios for another couple of years, there's nothing on the books. Can you see them going out and signing a Corbin Burns to a major deal and maybe backloading some of that money later on and trying to extend, I guess, for the lack of a better term, this window?
So I do think I only remember because I had asked the same question to Shy once about backloading, front loading, because I think I think that is something that happens more in other sports. Like I think
Right.
from what I understand, from what I've been told, is like you can backload, front load with like bonuses, but in terms of
But
like
it's all
cap,
AAV.
yeah, in terms of cap
Okay.
hit AAV, I think it ends up what ends up happening is it ends up being the same anyways. So like it might change by a couple $1 million here and there, but like by and large it'll be the same. Unless
Right.
you're actually deferring money, which we talked many times about last year. But and maybe there'll be some deferrals for a little bit, but by and large, I think you're avoiding the front loading, back loading. But I do think that it is serious. See that they seem to be in on these guys. First on okay, so on Nick Pivetta, I am like inherently biased because I'd like to see Canadians play for the for the Blue Jays. And on top of that, he's been such a dog for the Red Sox that like
Yeah.
in the best possible way that I wouldn't mind seeing. He just always seems to be that pitcher that comes out and like guts you through like 6 2/3, and you're like, oh man, he's given up like 3 hits and no runs over 6 2/3. Like, how did he get away with this? Like it didn't seem like he's had like overwhelming stuff, but he just has always been able to do that. So I wouldn't mind seeing Nick Pivetta, and I can't imagine he's going to cost as much as a Corbin Burns or a Max Fried or a Blake Snell.
He
Um,
better not. I mean,
yeah,
I'm cheering for him. I hope he does very well, but
no, I'm with you. And so let's say so if Pavetta lefty, Max Fried obviously a lefty as well. I mean, if I'm picking between the two of them, I'm probably picking Max Fried, right? Like
yeah.
I think most people are picking Max Fried. Not to diss. I know I just went on about Nick Pavetta, but not to diss him. I think he's a very good pitcher, but Max Fried is one of the elite pitchers and or can be. And if he actually is available, I would love to see Max Fried. I think I'd pick Max Fried over Blake Snell and Corbin Burns, as crazy as that would sound. But it's funny to think that if you were to build an entire starting rotation out of 5 righties, if one of those guys, or let me put it another way, if 3 of those guys was Corbin Burns, Kevin Gosman, and Jose Barrios, I think you feel pretty good about that,
Yeah.
right? Like even if there are no left-handed starting pitchers, I think you feel pretty good about that. And the other part of it too is, I mean, you talked about money being on the books after this coming season. I mean, Bassett is a free agent after this coming
Yeah.
season, so maybe Bassett even gets traded at the deadline if you do sign a Corbin Burns or a Blake Snell or a Max Fried or let's say a Nick Pivetta. Obviously, it hinges to a certain extent on believing that Bowden Francis is the real deal, but I mean, we talked about him taking a no hitter into the ninth inning like twice in the span of like 10 days or whatever it was last year. So I feel like most people do believe he is the real deal. So yeah, I mean, if you're going into 2026 with a starting rotation of Burns or Fried or Snell plus Gosman, Barrios, Francis, question mark. That's still, and maybe that question mark is Alek Manoah, who we talked about. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
pretty good place to be, right?
Yariel's gonna be in there. They're
Yeah,
gonna, yeah. Do you believe in Francis?
I do. You know what I do? I had to take some time to come around to it because I remember I was working the game.
You've
Uh,
seen too much.
yeah, yeah. I was actually working the game where he did the first no hitter. I was at the ballpark for that one, and I remember sitting in the radio booth thinking like, oh my god, am I actually going to see a no hitter like with my own eyes for the Blue Jays? Like I actually was like, oh my god, I'm getting a little nervous. Like, what are we going to talk about like when this happens? And then he gives up the home run. Tough luck, right? Too bad that happened, but it's funny because after that game, I thought to myself, Scott, like, okay, you know what? I want to see him do it again. I want to see him not take a no hitter into the ninth inning, but I just want to see him like play well, continually moving forward. And then he did,
And
and
then
then
you
he
had
did
to
it
wait a
again.
full 4 days for it to happen.
Exactly right. So I think he's done it enough against both bad teams, against good teams. He has stymied all sorts of batters that I think I believe that he will be that guy. He did say at the end of the season that one of his goals going into next year was that he wants to throw harder. And I
Mhm.
don't know if I necessarily want him to throw harder. Like
Yeah.
if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like just leave it the way it is. Just continue the pinpoint command. That's what you want. But I don't know if I necessarily want to hear reports of him like out of the spring in a couple of months being like, God, Francis is throwing 4 miles an hour harder. I'm like, I don't know. The way pitching injuries are these days, I don't know if I want to be hearing that from Bowden.
It's really funny with Bowden Francis because when I saw him pitch in spring training, I drove my nuts, my nuts, my I drove my wife nuts because I couldn't stop talking about him. He really stood out. I mean, the curveball was incredible, and I kept saying if he can just add one more deceptive pitch to this fastball curveball that he's got, he's gonna be lights out. And then to watch that splitter come out
Mm.
of nowhere and then be as dominant as it was, I almost had to back my expectations off because I was just like, too small of a sample size, Scott. Like, you can't lose your mind over this. Like, we've got an ace in the hole, but that's what it felt like. It felt like this guy had just like developed throughout the years. He's now like 27, 28. He's been through the rigors. He's dealt with injury problems. He knows how his body works. He's found pitches that work. Like, it just really felt like the culmination of all this hard work he's been putting in over the years came together. But I'm still waiting on April. Like, I'm so excited to see how he comes out of the gate. And I almost wonder if he has a bump in the road, how does he deal with that? That's another one too, because whenever you add a new pitch and it becomes as deadly as that splitter became and just increases the your ability to get hitters out in different scenarios, you kind of got to wait for the rest of the league to catch up on the book on you, right? And I don't know if that's happened yet. So I'm hopeful for Francis, but I'm also just like, I don't want to get hurt again. I got hurt with Manoah. I don't want to just buy in and be like, we've got a perennial ace. Like,
No, I know what you mean, and I think too. I mean, we saw him to a certain extent bounce back last year, even in itself, right? Because he started the season as a starter, and then he got lit up. Look, I believe
mm-hmm.
it was the first start of the year where the Blue Jays got no hit by Ronel Blanco, like at Minute Maid Park in Houston, and I'm pretty sure Francis was on the other side of that game, and he got blasted. Like it was like batting practice for the Astros out there. They were just teeing off on his fastball, and it was bad. It was a bad start to the
Yeah.
season for him. And then he went on the IL, and you kind of thinking to yourself, okay, well, what is he going to look like when he comes back? Like, is he going to be? Are we going to be talking about piggybacking Bowden with Yariel Rodriguez for the rest of the year? Then Yariel went on the IL. All of a sudden, you're like, oh boy, like what is happening right now to this pitching staff? And then he comes back and I mean, it took a while for him to come back when he worked on things in the minors, but it just the things he was doing to get batters out beyond actually the usage of his pitches, but just like the demeanor on the mound, the way he was communicating with the catchers, the way he looked in the dugout in between innings. And I know that's all stuff you can't really measure, but like I feel like the mentality of the Bowden Francis that came back post injury later in the
Mm-hmm.
year, which we saw with the no hitters and all that stuff, that Bowden Francis was markedly different than the Bowden Francis we saw to start the season. So well, again, we'll have to see because you're right. I don't know if I want to like 100% buy
Yeah.
in, but I think if mentality wise, if that's where he remains, regardless of his stuff, which is pretty nasty, but if that's where he stays going into spring training, I think we'll be pretty happy. Because
And
like you know what the Manoah stuff too is I do believe that Manoah like there was some mentalities issues there, right? Like I think like he got married in the off season. I'm not blaming that, but it just I think he did a lot of non baseball things in the off season, and then I think there were some off field stuff that I think bothered him, and he never really found his groove, and then he got injured. Basically,
yeah.
right? So it was just like one thing after another that didn't really lend itself well. And you know what? He since then has talked about how he's fixed the mentality and how he's changed things around for himself. So maybe that's where it starts. And I wonder if that's why you often hear so many pitchers say like it's about like what's up here and not what's in your hands essentially.
Yeah, if they could add a Max Fried and then some of these peripheral pitching possibilities kind of become legit, the Blue Jays starting pitching could really be very good again. Like they're not that far off of 2023 when they were one of the most dominant staffs in baseball.
No, it's true. And I mean, I think you've kind of gotten used to that. No, like since we talked about Hyunjin Ryu signing with the team, like since Ryu became a Blue Jay, I feel like in the last, like, that's what, 4 years, 4 or 5 years now, one of the hallmarks of the team has been having, and I mean, this dials into the whole run prevention thing we always hear Atkins talk about, but I mean, it does start with the starting pitching, and you need good defense and you need good relievers, and those are things they're going to have to continue to A, develop, and B, especially when it comes to the bullpen. I mean, you're basically rebuilding the entire bullpen from scratch, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that might even include Jordan Romano and Eric Swanson. Like, who knows what
It
happens to
might,
those guys,
yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
we'll have to see, but it does start with the starting pitching. So if that is the case, Scott, I do wonder if they just put a, like, this front office seems to put a premium on those kinds of players being the guys they want to go after.
All right. I won't keep you much longer here, Show. I have one more Blue Jays question and a couple MLB questions before we get you out of here. Bo Bichette. I mean, this is a kid who in 2021 and 2022 had a combined WAR of over 14. He had the most hits in baseball both those years. He was close to the top in hits in 2023 had it not been for those 3 weeks he spent on the IL. How much do you believe in Bo Bichette? Do you think that we're going to see a return to what we saw out of him as a 23, 24-year-old?
If he is healthy, I don't see why not, right? Because I mean, think about last year, right? He had so many injuries that it would almost be impossible for anyone to play through them, especially for one who, like, especially for someone who is a shortstop, right? And then on top of that, for someone who has such an active swing with so many different pieces of the swing, for Bo, it just, I'm not, like, I did think he could fix it and fight through it, but he had so many, like, he had the back spasms, or pardon me, the neck spasms. He had the calf strain multiple, I think in three separate calf strains, which is
Yeah.
bonkers. I don't know if you've ever had a calf strain. I have, and it's not fun. And I'm a normal mortal human being, not a professional athlete, right? So I
Yes.
can only imagine what it feels like for these guys, like planting on the field and running base to base and getting, like, legging it out to first and making the plays in the infield, and we kind of know on top of that, Bo is, like, an average defender already, and then he had all these injuries. So I think, to answer your question, yes, if he is healthy, I don't see why he can't be the Bo Bichette that we have come to know and love. The problem with that is, let's say he is healthy, right? Let's say he's healthy and we start opening day. Bo Bichette is the starting shortstop in 2025 and he's raking. Then the conversation will be one of two things. It'll be either extend Bo Bichette if they haven't already done so, and I got to imagine they won't do that. So extend Bo Bichette in season, or trade him, right? Because if he goes to free agency, I can't imagine. I hope I'd be, I've been wrong about a lot of things before, but I can't imagine he's going to go to free agency and then come back to the Blue Jays, right? Like,
Yeah.
and this goes back to the quarterback conversation we were having before. Shortstops are that position in baseball, right? Like,
Hmm.
everyone wants a pretty good shortstop defensively and an elite shortstop offensively. Everyone wants that guy. So, and maybe you think Bo's future is at second base. Who knows? But everyone wants one of the elite offensive players in the game, and he's gonna command a titanic amount of money. So I do think we will see a return to form for Bo, but I can't help but think that if he does do that, it probably means he won't be a Blue Jay long term. It is funny how things change so quickly, Scott. I mean, if we were having this conversation before the beginning of the 2024 season, so if you were doing this time, I guess in 2023,
Yeah.
between the seasons, I think the conversations would be completely flipped between Bo and Vladdy. It'd be like, yeah, sign Vladdy to the mega, or sign Bo to the mega deal, trade Vladdy for peanuts, like, get him off the team. And now it's the complete opposite, which I think is kind of funny.
I was just going to bring up how wild the narrative has changed on these two over the years. And this is just speaking from my own perspective, like I had come 2021, 2022, I was like, we've got to extend both of these. I still kind of feel that way, but I was like, we got to extend both of these. And then as time went on, I was like, if for some crazy reason they cannot get an extension done on these guys, it would be career malpractice to not trade them for everything you can get before free agency. And now I've kind of hit this point where I almost feel defeated, where I'm just like, I'm just preparing for them both to walk for nothing and this team to be without any sort of core going into 2026. Where are you at on Bo and Vlad's show? Do you think that these are still viewed as core pieces by this front office? Or do you think that this, all the Juan Soto talk, is for good reason because they're trying to kickstart a new core?
I do view them as core pieces because, to your point, if I can't count Juan Soto because he's on the team, then like if you're discussing what comprises the core right now, and I find we're really talking about position players because I think if you were including pitchers, I think you probably would include Gosman and you probably would include Barrios, but like pitchers are almost like their own thing. So let's you put the pitchers aside, and you're only talking about the core players beyond Bo and Vladdy. I'm not really sure who is the core player, right? Like I like watching Spencer Horwitz play. I like watching Kirk play. I do, but I'm
Dalton
not sure.
Varsho.
Varsho maybe because he's young and under contract, but like is Varsho really the kind of player you think of when? And hey, finally won his Gold Glove. Thank God for that. But
Funny how quick years of control go too. I mean, it's wild to me that Dalton Varsho has 2 years left now.
yeah,
Like,
it's very crazy. It's nuts, right? It feels like we've been both watching Varsho for a long time, and that you expect to watch him for a long time. But 2 years is not that long a time.
no.
But you're right. Beyond Varsho, maybe Kirk. They're not there. I would say there are no one else in the core apart from Bo and Vlad. So I do view them as core players. I just can't help but think that with Vladdy in particular, he is one of those kinds of players who, like, his cachet means so much more to the Blue Jays than it does to literally any other team in Major League Baseball, right? Like, let's just say, for the sake of this argument, that he goes to free agency and teams X, Y, and Z are lining up to offer him deals, right? Like the Mariners want to sign Vladdy or the Yankees want to sign Vladdy. Like it's only money to those teams, right? Like they're not really giving up anything other than dollars and cents to sign Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Like the Blue Jays would essentially be passing on one of their best homegrown players who has said he wants to stay here and he loves
Has
Toronto and
Canadian ties.
born in Montreal. You're right. Like his dad played in Montreal. Like it just he has so many connections to this country, specific beyond having played for the Blue Jays, that I think if he were to leave, you'd see rioting at the Rogers Center. Like in a way, I don't think you would see if Bo left. And I'm not saying that
Yes.
Bo is bad or is that Bo wants out or Bo hates the Blue Jays or anything like that. I think it's just that Bo has never, until he really clarified with Shy at the end of the season, Bo has never really like gone out of his way to be like effusive in his praise for like his time as a Blue Jay, whereas
Yeah.
like Vladdy has, and I think that's like won the hearts and minds of a lot of Blue Jays fans, for lack of a better term.
Until Bo has a hot April and May, in which case we'll be right back to having you on the show and talking about how do we lock up Bo. All right, last couple questions here, my man. Again, thanks so much for taking the time to be here. I always love chatting baseball with you. I know Ken Rosenthal was quoted as saying Alex Bregman and Scott Boras are aiming higher than most projections have them at, specifically at a deal much closer to the 11-year, $350 million deal that Manny Machado signed in February of 2023. This feels completely delusional to me, but I also feel like I might be a little biased as somebody who's not a big Astros guy. We did watch Matt Chapman get his money in the end, but it's also half of what Alex Bregman's after. Am I crazy in thinking that just seems like an ungettable deal? Like Alex Bregman's not Manny Machado, right? Or
No,
do you think there is that 300 million mega deal out there for him somewhere?
man, okay. I'll put it this way: the only team I think that would pay him that are the Astros, right?
Okay.
Because similarly, like we had this conversation just now about
With
Vladdy,
Vlad.
like it's the same thing, right? Like it's like the cachet for the Astros to make Bregman a lifetime Astro in the same way that Jose Altuve will be, and I mean
Mm-hmm.
Springer wasn't, Correa wasn't, but Bregman can be, and we'll have to see. The Astros are interesting because they will have to pay Kyle Tucker eventually, and that's coming
Yes.
up. I mean, like that's not on, it's on the horizon, like pretty soon on the horizon. So I don't know if they want to pay Bregman that much money, but it would seem like they're the only team that could make that determination. Because I'm with you. I mean, Bregman's on the wrong side of 30. He missed time just this past season for like elbow issues in his throwing
Mm-hmm.
arm. And don't get me wrong, one of the elite offensive third basemen in all of baseball. He would look pretty good out there on the hot corner for the Blue Jays. I would not turn it down, but not at that money.
Yeah.
Like that is bonkers money. And I mean, Boris has got to say it. He has to. And we know that the Boris offseason last year was pretty bad, all things
Yeah.
considered, for basically every single one of his clients. But I understand why he's doing it. But I would be stunned if he gets that much money based on his age, because typically, as we know, like you might get like 3 to 4 really good years out of Alex Bregman, and then for the rest of that deal, you're tied to that like an albatross, right? So
The
I
other thing that stood out to me too is like when you go over his, because I actually, when I heard that, I started deep diving into his stats, being like, hey, I'm a biased idiot. I'm obviously not seeing something here. And even after going over his stats, I'm like, I don't know. Like, the thing that stood out is 41 home runs in 2019. And as soon as anyone's career year is 2019, I write it off. I'm like, oh yeah, juiced ball year? No, we're not counting that. His next highest home run total is 31 in 2018, which you can also start to tie into that. That's when we started to see juice balls. And then the next highest show is 24 home runs. And I'm not saying that there isn't value in guys that don't hit home runs. That's Alex Bregman is obviously a very well-rounded, valuable third baseman, one of the best at the hot corner in Major League Baseball. I just 350 million. Ooh.
Yeah, if you're going to be paying out the nose as the Blue Jays, then I gotta think you'd rather pay up for Pete Alonso. You know what I mean? Because at the very least, Pete Alonso, like, is Pete Alonso an elite defensive player? Probably not, right? Like he's probably like Vladdy, probably fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Vladdy, I don't think is an elite first baseman defensively, but he's like pretty good, and you can live with pretty good. Is he a pretty good third baseman defensively? Probably not, right? Like he's probably probably at or below average defensively at third base. But like if like I think this is the conversation we're all having, right? Like, are you willing to move Vladdy to third and live with like that kind of defense? If you're getting the production from a Pete Alonso, yes. But are you willing to keep Vladdy at first base? I mean, yes, obviously the answer to that question is yes. But are you willing to do that if like the third baseman is Alex Bregman? Sure, but is it Alex Bregman at $350 million? No. Like, so
And like you
yeah,
said, at least with Alonso, it's addressing an actual area of
yes,
need that they have,
yes.
right?
And because the other thing too is like I know the Blue Jays have an obvious need at third base, but let's say it's not Vladdy and it's not Bregman, then it's either got to be Willie Adames or it's got to be someone internal. Like that's because there are not a lot of other massive, like, there are not a lot of slam dunk options. Like if you are going away from all of those options, then you're kind of heading for something that is a relative unknown.
Yes.
Do you really want to be paying a lot of money for unknowns? Personally, I would say no, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
I
I
mean,
don't
if the
know.
George Springer contract taught us anything, it's that even $150 million isn't a sure bet,
Yeah,
right? Like
and
you
that's the
pretty much,
biggest contract the Blue Jays have ever handed out to George Springer.
yeah. And the truth is too, is you almost need to double it to get a sure thing. You know, like to get a Trey Turner, to get a Juan Soto, to get a Rafael Devers, you need to be in the astronomical money range, or you're kind of rolling the dice a little bit.
Like even when you mentioned the Rangers being one of those teams that spend a lot of money. I remember when the Rangers paid Corey Seager and then they paid Marcus Semien after he had his
Mm-hmm.
monster year with the Blue Jays, and I thought, dang, like good for you, Semien. Like I wanted Semien to stay. I really liked him. But I never really considered him the one that got away because at the time that was a gargantuan contract, right?
Yeah.
Like that was an insane amount of money, and I think everyone and their mother was like, "This contract's going to age really poorly. The Rangers don't ever win. It's not going to be. They're going to regret it." And you know what? it worked out for them. They won the World Series. It doesn't matter what happens now. Like
Yeah,
it actually doesn't matter if Marcus Semien doesn't play for the rest of his career and still
truly.
collects all. Like they won the World Series. It was their franchise's first ever title. Like no one can take that away from them, right? But like that's why it's worth it. Like if the Rangers didn't win, you'd be moaning about the money you paid Marcus Semien, right? So
Absolutely.
I don't know. It's such a tough line to walk, I find.
Okay, let's go on this one. Chris Sale, talk about a resurgence in his career. He had hit a point where most baseball pundits and fans were kind of expecting him to just kind of fizzle out and ride off into the sunset. 35 years old, wins a Cy Young award, completely rejuvenates his career in Atlanta. He is career numbers wise sitting at 53.4 wins above replacement, 138 and 83, and an ERA of 3.04. Has the man put himself in some Hall of Fame
Ooh,
conversations with this Cy Young win?
that's a great question. I think you know what? I wonder if the injuries will have sapped that to to a certain extent. Because I firmly believe if Chris Sale was healthy his whole career, slam dunk,
Yeah.
no doubt, first ballot Hall of Famer. And the Cy Young helps, but I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of voters will, and I think too is the Hall of Fame in baseball is notoriously snobby. I don't know if you're like a small hall guy or a big hall guy, Scott. I think I do tend to lean more on the small hall
Mm-hmm.
side of things. I think I like the idea of it being of Cooperstown being a little more exclusive. And having said that, Chris Sale, I think had he been healthy, would be in Cooperstown. Even with the Cy Young, though, I unless he continues to do this for another couple of years, I wonder if it's kind of like too late to a certain extent because he's not a young man. It's not like
No, he's
he's
not.
right. He's not like 29 winning his first Cy Young, right? So I think that's kind of the sticky point for me would be like the longevity, the career longevity.
I'm really curious to see what happens because if I really do think if he gets like another nomination next year and kind of goes into like this weird Charlie Morton end of his
Sure.
30s where
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
like, huh. So I'm kind of rooting for him because he has had, I mean, I not a Sox fan, obviously. So one black mark there against him as a Red Sox hater. But you know what? Like he has had an incredible career so far. And like you stated, really the only thing holding him back from this conversation is injuries. So it would be kind of cool
Let
in
me
Atlanta out of the, you know,
let me ask you this, Scott, because we're having the Hall of Fame conversation. Is Giancarlo Stanton a Hall of Famer to you? Like if Stanton gets to the 500 home run club, but doesn't have any of the other stats that typically go along with being in 500 home run club, does he get to the Hall of Fame? Because I asked I think it was John Morosi. I had Morosi on one of our shows recently, and I asked him that question. He was like, if he gets to the 500 level, if he gets that club, doesn't matter. He's in. And I thought,
well, tell
man,
Gary
like
Sheffield that, but yeah.
yeah, right. I thought to myself, like, I don't know if it's quite as clear cut for me. But just because we were talking about Chris Sale has dealt with so many injuries. Giancarlo Stanton has also dealt with a fair amount of injuries that like probably changed the trajectory of his career. World Series or no, like forget the World Series with the Yankees. Like if you are anywhere near the 500 home run club and you win a World Series with the Yankees, you're going to the Hall of Fame, right? It's funny because people were like slam dunk Hall of Famer. And I couldn't help but think that like, man, if Stanton's a Hall of Famer and he doesn't get 500 home runs, but he's close, then like we need to revisit some people who are not in the Hall of Fame. Like
Yes.
we need to revisit like Carlos Delgado not being in the
That was
Hall of Fame.
the number one name on my mind. It's so funny how much the Hall of Fame I just like I'm bitter and tainted towards it because Carlos Delgado and Dave Stieb aren't in it, which
Steve,
is
yeah.
ridiculous that that's what's tainting it for me. But I'm like, you're not going to put Dave Stieb in the Hall of Fame. You're not going to put Carlos Delgado, and we're going to have some of these other guys. Like I don't know, like, but
Like Todd Helton and Mauer and like a lot of these guys, like they're very good players, but like are
yes,
they like I mean they're Hall of Famers because they're the Hall of Fame now, but Like, would I have voted for them? I don't know. Maybe that's why it's a good thing I don't have a Hall of Fame ballot. Let's put it that way.
SHO ALLI. Honestly, my man, thank you so much for joining me. I always love talking baseball with you, buddy, and I look forward to twisting your arm and trying to convince you to come back maybe later in the off season here, and we can kind of revisit some of this stuff. But yeah, man, anything to plug here before we let you go?
Well, if you're a football fan, my off-season work is the Fan Checkdown, which is good. This is a weekday show from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. So we talk all things the NFL, myself and Donovan Bennett. But I'm hoping I get to do some Jays talks, or at least I get to produce Blake's or Blair's Jays talks between now and the end of the year. I think last year was it IKF who signed around Boxing Day. I think he was like
Yes.
the most like the biggest significant one like first. So I'm hoping we don't have to wait until Boxing
Oh,
Day
me
to
too,
find
buddy.
out not even about Juan Soto, just about literally anyone. Give me just a little shred of something before Boxing Day. That's all I ask.
Oh, I'm with you, buddy. I don't want to be like waiting in January for the
Yeah,
first shoe to drop.
no, I'm with you.
All right, my man. Thanks again. Really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, anytime, Scott.